Next on our agenda, we are going to have a panel session, and we have three panelists. That is our presenter, Dr. Ssuna, Dr. Andrew Crump, and Dr. Sylvia Baluka. We are going to start with Dr. Andrew Crump. Dr. Andrew Crump is a lecturer in animal cognition and welfare at the Royal Veterinary College. He is also a postdoctoral researcher at the London School of Economics. He studies animal welfare in diverse species, and he also works very closely with NGOs, the government, and many stakeholders in the animal sector. Dr. Andrew is also a key advisor and advised the UK government on the Animal Sentience Act of 2022. So join me as we welcome Dr. Andrew Crump. Andrew Crump, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So Dr. Andrew, we are going to start with the first question. And we know that you've been working with Dr. Ssuna on these guidelines, and you have developed an animal welfare policy for an organization in Tanzania. So in your perspective, how hard or how easy is it to adopt these guidelines by organizations, and what are the challenges or opportunities? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, no change happens overnight, and the guidelines won't be institutionalized by any organization overnight, because there are obstacles to change. So I think there are key economic and cultural potentially obstacles. So in terms of the economic obstacles, the sort of training that Paul was talking about costs money to bring in trainers, but it also costs staff time. If staff are being trained on animal welfare, then they're not out there helping with the organization's core mission. So there are costs associated. There's also, I think, differences in cultural values. So last year, Paul and I were in Tanzania advising an organization there, and that organization worked with the Maasai. And for the Maasai, the number of cattle that one has is a reflection of your wealth. And so we had a situation where the Maasai pasture lands were severely overgrazed, and the cattle that they had were really malnourished because there were simply too many of them for the land to support. So here you had a kind of conflict between the Maasai's cultural values of have as big a herd as possible on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the animal welfare imperative of have fewer cattle, but give them proper nutrition. So these kind of obstacles obviously do crop up, and I think we need to be very sensitive to that. On the other hand, I'm firmly of the belief that there are real opportunities here. So in terms of the economics of this, I think from donors, there's a real push to ensure that organizations do commit to acceptable animal welfare standards. So there's real reputational risk for international development organizations if they're found not to meet these kind of basic welfare standards. I think as well in the long run on projects, it can be much more cost efficient to think about welfare. Let's say that your project is giving goats to recipients. If you don't provide those recipients with proper training on how to look after the goats, they're much more likely to get diseased, they're much less likely to produce lots of milk, and they're more likely to die. Whereas if you give them that kind of basic training at the start of this is how you care for a goat, that animal's probably going to live for much longer, be much less likely to need veterinary care, and produce much more milk. So I think there are, in the long run, real economic opportunities here. I think as well, although I talked about cultural challenges, it's my experience that care for animals is not associated with any particular group of people. I think wherever I go in the world, people have that sort of level of care for animals. They want their animals to have good lives. They want their animals to have good welfare. And so I think that can be a really powerful force for change if we can kind of tap into that and use that to actually improve welfare on these projects.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Andrew. I think we highly agree with you when it comes to some of the obstacles that come with the cultural values of these communities. But I will also agree that that could be used as an opportunity to actually spread the gospel of animal welfare. So secondly, and that's going to lead us to my second question. So what could be your recommendations to development corporate organizations as far as the health and welfare of animals in their projects is concerned?
Yeah, shameless plug here, but adopt the guidelines. I think in the process of adopting the guidelines and of institutionalizing animal welfare more broadly, though, there are two things that I'd really emphasize, because I think if we do two things, everything else kind of follows. The first of those things is training. Staff training is absolutely critical. I think where we do encounter animal welfare issues in development organizations, it's not because people are choosing to do the wrong thing. It's because they don't necessarily know what the right thing is. And so we need to build up that knowledge base, and that happens through training. So training staff on what's the right way to care for animals, how do we ensure that recipients are going to treat them well? That's absolutely critical. You need training, you need that baseline knowledge. The second thing I think is ensuring that there's responsibility within the organization. So named individuals who are actually responsible for animal welfare. And that should be, as Paul was talking about, with that governance structure from high levels within the organization, right down to project managers who are on the ground. And if you have those people who are actually responsible, then I think that's the way to enact real change. And so if you have those two things, training so that people know what the right thing to do is, and responsible individuals whose job it is to implement, at least in part, to implement these guidelines to ensure good welfare, I think everything else then sort of follows naturally on.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks.
And I agree, training is the way to go, and it's cultural change. And our next panelist is going to be Dr. Sylvia Baluka. Dr. Sylvia is a holder of a bachelor's in veterinary medicine, a master of science in food safety from Michigan State University. She has an MBA. She has a doctor of philosophy in veterinary medicine, particularly animal health economics and epidemiology. Dr. Sylvia has experience of 25 years in academia, research, and livestock sector development at the national, regional, and international levels. She also has a lot of expertise in animal welfare, animal health economics, and veterinary epidemiology. She is also the coordinator of FAO in paraprofessional projects in Uganda. Dr. Sylvia, from your vast experience in the various fields of work and service, how important can these guidelines be, especially for projects involving animals that are aimed at improving the livelihood of poor communities?
Thank you so much, Delayla. I didn't realize I was muted. And thank you to everyone in the team that has been working behind the scenes to ensure that we have this guideline that is not only going to serve us in Uganda, but serving the different stakeholders at the international level. I must commend you for the job well done. I would like to add my voice that these guidelines are important, not only for the development organizations, but they are important for all the stakeholders along the value chain, from the farmer or the animal owner who raises and looks after this animal on a daily basis, even the consumers for the case of the food animals, animal welfare. My other hat is food safety, and animal welfare has so much to do with the food safety of the animal products that get to the market. Animal welfare is important. I can sum up by saying animal welfare is important for all of us, for the different stakeholders, and therefore including the development corporations or development organizations. So these guidelines can be a very important resource for the organizations that are implementing projects. We are talking about development projects. And when you talk about development projects, the focus of such projects is, first of all, to make better, to improve. And if that is the case, then sustainability is should be made a priority. Animal welfare, therefore, becomes a priority. So these guidelines are going to support other SOPs and other regulations that within the different areas of jurisdiction or the different countries where these projects are taking place. For instance, in the case of Uganda, we have the national guidelines for use of animals in research and education that have been developed by the Uganda National Council for Science and Technology. We also have the some acts that were formulated by the Ministry of Agriculture and Industry and Fisheries many years back that guide us to ensure that there is no cruelty against animals when they are being handled for the different purposes. So these guidelines are, first of all, are coming into support and also reinforce what has already been proposed by the national guidelines that are already in existence. So definitely these guidelines, if they are used together with existing national guidelines, they will provide synergy, they will also strengthen and bridge certain gaps. I do note that some of the laws that we have are quite old. They've been in existence, maybe some for over 50 years. So these guidelines that have been prepared after considering the current context, where how animals are being handled and how projects are being implemented, they're definitely very important. And if we make use of them as we design different projects, it will help us to ensure that the animals or the livestock being that are involved in the different projects are handled well. There is no harm, and also productivity is not affected, because most of the time that the animals that projects work with do not necessarily belong to the projects. They belong to the farmers, and farmers are looking for productivity, they are looking for livelihoods. And the way we handle these animals can actually affect or undermine those goals that the farmers have for their animals. Whenever we handle animals, the way we manipulate them, we cause stress, and that can affect physiologically, that does affect their productivity. And the farmer could lose a certain number of liters, for instance, in the case of dairy animals, just because animals have been handled in a way that was not appropriate. Milk production can be reduced. And in the case of poultry, when poultry are not handled well, in case of, for instance, the layers, they do cut production as well. You realize that a poultry house where they were collecting 10 trays or 100 trays, when you have a certain operation or a manipulation of these layers, if you don't observe the animal welfare, they can even cut egg production up to almost by 50%. So in summary, I would like to restate that the guidelines are timely and they are a welcome addition to the number of tools that we have that help to guide us as veterinarians, but also it will be important for us to translate these guidelines for other animal handlers who are not veterinarians. We have animal handlers, we have farmers that also need to appreciate certain aspects of these guidelines so that whatever is within their control can be done well, so that the health of the animals is maintained, the physiological status of the animals is maintained, so that their productivity is not affected, so that their quality of life is not affected, so that their behavioral patterns are not affected. And of course, when animal welfare is not good, we are talking about productivity being affected, but we are also talking about reproductivity. Some animals, the breeding cycles are also affected when animal welfare is compromised. So in summary, I would say that these guidelines have very important utility in the projects that are pro animals in the different settings, whether they are breeding projects or they are projects where animals are just, for instance, even when they're not experimental studies, sometimes we just move animals into a crash to demonstrate certain things. Sometimes, whenever animals are, for instance, moved from one environment to the other, depending on how they're handled, how they're transported, sometimes just having visitors or a big group of people all of a sudden surrounding an animal can threaten an animal, does affect the environment where the animal lives, and that alone could actually affect the behavior and performance of this animal. So the use of this guideline, the good thing, they are quite broad, addressing different aspects, husbandry and others, feeding. I can I can happily add my voice to appreciate that these guidelines are very important and they are going to play a critical role. And they are also quite simple and easy to understand compared to certain scientific write-ups and publications. So I do believe that they are going to help simplify many of these concepts of animal welfare, and the guidelines also do introduce or try to clarify the domains. Many of us are familiar with the freedoms of animal welfare, but we are not very familiar with the domains. And it's good that the guidelines have also brought in the domains and also presented them in a simplified way that is all the different stakeholders can be able to understand. That's what I can say in summary. In case it's something that I've not articulated very well, I'll be very happy to come back and try to make it clearer. I would like to thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be able to join this distinguished panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sylvia. Thank you for those insightful views, and you have emphasized that animal welfare directly affects productivity and reproductivity of animals. And this leads us to our second question. And so what recommendations do you give development cooperation organizations as far as the health and welfare of animals in their projects is concerned?
Okay, thank you very much. The recommendations are that development corporations in the design, they should get interested. They should get interested in the finer details of how the animals that are going to be involved in the project are going to be handled. So in other words, they should provide SOPs, they should provide some checklists that should be followed whenever these animals are being handled, so as to minimize. We can't say that it's possible to handle animals without exerting any stress or without affecting their physiology in any way. But with the SOPs, with some checklists that should be followed, we can be able to minimize or mitigate the effects that these animals could suffer as a result of being handled or manipulated in the course of the project activities, so that the losses, the effects and therefore the losses that the farmer could incur are also minimized or mitigated for. That is one recommendation. The other one is that development corporations should, while constituting project teams who are going to be involved and carry out these projects, they should be able to take care of the different needs and aspects of the animals. For instance, especially if it's a long-term project, besides having a project manager, we need to be sure that we have provided for an animal health, for instance, expert or service provider who will be able to check on the health of these animals in the course of project implementation. We also need someone who understands the nutrition very well, and someone who understands the behavioral aspects to be able to look at the environment, how these animals are grouped up, how they are housed, and even the siting and location of the housing. We really need to look at all those aspects. I know sometimes because of financial constraints, sometimes one person will be recruited as a project coordinator and will be expected to handle everything. But we need to make sure that all those different areas of expertise or skills that are needed to handle these animals appropriately are available within the project team. I think that way we'll be able to look out for the interests of these animals and also mitigate what could go wrong as we work with animals in our project activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sylvia. And at this juncture,
I just want to thank our participants for this webinar, for attending the webinar, and would like to encourage you to use the guidelines if you're having projects that you're implementing, and to promote them in the communities wherever you are. I would also invite Karen to give the final closing remarks. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Paul and speakers. This was a very interesting talk with lots of insights, and we really appreciate your ideas on the guidelines. I guess you gave us a lot of take-home messages and to work on. I understand that the guidelines have been set out quite well and are accessible, and now the task is to put them into practice and to support NGO and others during this process, which seems to require some more resources and some more collaboration. As WTS and AWeCCA, we are available to your questions, and we will provide assistance in the use and adoption of the guidelines. And I hope we, together in a collaborative approach, can help make them accessible to many organizations across the world, and in particular on the African continent. So for now, we are finished. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Andrew, Sylvia, Delilah, and Paul very much for your contribution. Have a great day and hope to see you next time.